So to say that I grew up in church would be a stretch, but I did attend church mostly during my elementary school age. There was a few years there where my dad was actually we'll call him the lead pastor. In fact, he was the only pastor. In fact, he was the only staff member of the church because it was a small church. For him, it was always a bivocational deal, meaning he had to work a real job. And I don't know why people say that. You know, he had to have a real job while he did his church job, as if this isn't a real job. And I would say after doing this for 30-some years, if this isn't a real job, then I don't know what a real job is. So we'll just go with that. But during his last stint there as a pastor, we used to do this thing before big church called Sunday school. Did anybody ever attend Sunday school? Okay, so some of you know what I'm talking about. I remember some of those times, but mostly what I remember is the storytelling. We had these people called Sunday school teachers. Anybody ever been a Sunday school teacher? Yeah, so some of you are older like I am. But they would tell us stories of the Bible, and they would use this thing called anybody remember? Flannel graph. I saw a couple of you already knew what I was talking about. If you have no idea what a flannel graph is, take some time this afternoon, Google it. That's the way we learned Bible stories back in the day. Well, as I entered middle school, back then we called it junior high school, Dad and Mom separated. In fact, they divorced. And I remember my dad standing up in church and resigning as he made that announcement. And for me, and pretty much for my family, to be honest with you, that was it. There was no more church. In fact, for the next 7+ years, I grew about as far away from church and God as you could possibly get. But I never forgot the retelling of some of those Bible stories, at least some of them. Then in the winter of 1982, I found myself trying to figure out life. I had just graduated the year before from high school. I had moved to Canada for a short period of time, and no, I wasn't running from anybody. I hadn't broke the law. My mom remarried, got up there, went up there, stayed for a little while, didn't like it. So after a very short time, I came back to what I would call familiar territory, where I felt like I fit in. I couldn't talk their language, You know what I'm talking about? And I could never get that down. So it was like, all right, I got to go back to my folks. So I moved in with my grandparents and got a job at Farm Fresh grocery store. Then one Wednesday night, my grandmother asked if I would take her to church, to which I obviously agreed to do. Now, little did I know that would be the beginning of maybe the reawakening of some of those stories that I had been taught years earlier. Before long, I would schedule a meeting to meet with the pastor who retold me the story of Jesus Christ, the gospel, as we've been talking about. Now, I'd heard it before, parts of it, but there was something different about what he shared with me that day. Long story short, I became a follower of Christ. In fact, I still have the piece of paper. He did the bridge illustration for me, and I have saved that. I still have it from, that was March 8th. I actually wrote the date on there, March 8th of 1982. And on the back, he even wrote a prayer for me to kind of walk through as I knelt in front of his desk that day and prayed to receive Christ as my Lord and Savior. And after that, I remember walking out of his office that day, and I couldn't explain it, but I knew things were different. And I remember getting into the car and making a commitment to God that I would become a reteller of that story. Because I was a little ticked off, to be honest with you, that nobody had ever shared it with me, at least in a way that made sense, at least in a way that I remembered. And I thought, if this is true, if what I just experienced in there is true, then everybody ought to hear this. Everybody needs to know that. And so I made a decision that day, and the first commitment I ever made to God was that I would do my best to share that story with anybody he would give me the chance to do that. I guess I felt like it was my turn to be the one to retell the story. Somebody had retold it to me, and so I felt like I needed to in return, share it with others. And it turns out I was right. I would go on to learn Matthew 28, the Great Commission, Acts chapter 1, the last words of Jesus before he would leave this earth, and his instructions were to all of us who were his followers to become storytellers, to be ones who would retell his story. Now, fast forward a few months. In the early 80s, I worked at a place called Newport News Shipyard Building and Dry Dock Company. I'm just curious, anybody ever worked there? Wow, a couple folks, at least you know where I'm at, all right? So it was during, honestly, it was during the heyday for sure. I mean, we were building new submarines and new aircrafts as fast as we possibly could. They were bringing in existing ones for us to repair and upgrade and do all this kind of stuff for them, and we were trying to turn them around as fast as we could. I don't know if you've ever done this. One of the most remarkable things I've ever done was I stood in the bottom of a dry dock. So if you don't know what a dry dock is, they bring the ship in, they pump all the water out as the ship begins to rest on these wooden boards underneath of it. And I one weekend, I always worked on submarines, but this particular weekend they asked me to come in and work on an aircraft carrier, and I thought, heck yeah, I'd never been on one, why not? Well, the really cool part was I got to walk down into the bottom of this dry dock underneath this aircraft carrier. And I mean, when I looked at all of that steel, I still do not know how those things float today. And, just with them empty, I can't imagine. You start putting all those airplanes and hundreds of people on there, it just doesn't make sense to me. But anyway, so I go to work there, and there's literally tens of thousands of people working there. And there's only a few ways to actually get in the shipyard and out of the shipyard. Now, because there were so many people, parking was limited. I would ride a bus. The bus would drop me off right at my gate, and you'd walk through the gate. And I'll be honest with you, it often felt like you were walking into prison for the day. I mean, you had to show what you were bringing in. When you left, you had to show what you were taking out. And there was only like 4, maybe 6 main gates that allowed us to get in and out. Well, at lunchtime, if you could imagine, thousands upon thousands of people would use those same gates to pass through, to go outside the gates for lunch. And again, we only had I think it was 45 minutes max for lunch, maybe only 30 minutes. It wasn't very long. But there were a lot of people who would do that unless you brought your lunch, which I often did, because I wanted that extra time just to kind of relax and chill and get ready for the second half of the day. And so I would do that. But occasionally I would venture out for lunch, only to be reminded of why I liked bringing my lunch. One, just fighting the crowds, to get in line to get something. If you had enough time to get food, you barely had enough time to get back to where you were supposed to be to check in after lunch. But a couple of things that I remember, and one particular thing I remember the couple times that I went outside during lunch, was there was this guy standing on the corner. And he was trying to yell over all the noise, all the cars that were passing by, the buses that were going by, the thousands of people who were trying to out-talk each other. And he's standing on the corner, and he had this, what I assumed was a Bible in his hand, and he's waving it, and he's just yelling, and I'm just watching people walk by him, and nobody seemed to be paying him any mind. Now, intrigued, being a new believer, because I hadn't been a follower of Christ very long, I would try to position myself close enough to hear what he was saying. Now, like I said, I did notice that no one seemed interested in a word that he had to say. Nobody stopped to listen. They just totally ignored him as he was staying there. And as I listened, I found myself kind of, to be honestly, turned off by what he was saying. Apart from yelling, he acted like he was mad, like he was just mad at everybody. To be honest with you, his storytelling wasn't very appealing either. In fact, it was so negative that I found myself wondering if what I had recently chose to believe and become a part of was really worth it, because I thought if that's what this is all about, then I wasn't 100% sure I wanted anything to do with it. Back inside the gates, people would talk about this crazy guy on the corner. Not once did I ever hear anybody say anything positive about not just him, but even what he was saying. Now, at the same time, I was beginning to feel a little guilty in my personal walk with God. And that was in regards to not sharing my faith, not retelling the story. I had made this commitment, but I wasn't being intentional about doing that. And so, or even bold for that matter. And so I was like, God, help me not be like that guy on the corner in some ways, but in other ways do help me be like him, because I do want to become more intentional about retelling the story. Now, as the new kid on the block in the shipyard, I hadn't been there working there very long either. I got to work, I was going to say with, but really I got to work under this older gentleman who I think had spent his entire life working at the shipyard. Now, when I say older, he seemed well past retirement age. Now, remember, I was my early 20s, and so anybody over 50 at that point seemed like they were 100 years old. You know what I'm talking about? And now I wonder, I am one of those guys, so I just wonder sometimes, how old do I look to the younger generation? But anyway, so when I looked at this guy, I just thought he probably should have retired like years and years ago. He was such, I don't know how else to say this, but for you to really capture what he was like, I wrote in my notes, he was just a disgruntled old fart. I don't know how else to say it, but that was him. He had this long face, bitter, okay? He never smiled. He just looked like he was mad at the world. Like when our crew would meet for a meeting, we would all be kind of huddled up, but he would stand outside the huddle. He just leave me alone was basically what he always said. I was always afraid to ask him a question because I knew he would just look at you like, that's the dumbest question I've ever heard in my life. Just leave me alone. He just had this way of just making you feel stupid, the way that he would look at you. And I thought, this guy's never going to teach me anything. And so I got paired with him so that he could teach me the ropes and how to do my job as a ship fitter and all of those things. But I thought, this guy could care less. He doesn't need my help, let alone want my help. And I thought, he's never going to teach me anything at all. He just wanted to be left alone. And I always thought, he just wants to retire. And I was always like, why doesn't he retire? Do us all a favor, even himself. I always thought about his family. I thought, man, his poor family, it must be really bad. So I remember when people would ask me, like, so what department are you working in? Who are you working with? And I would tell them, I'm working with old man Charlie Taylor. And they would bust out laughing. And they would look at me and go, it just sucks to be you, doesn't it? This guy had a reputation, and I thought, does everybody in the shipyard know old man Charlie Taylor? And turns out I think they did, and they knew his reputation for sure. Now, this is where God began to work on me and began to answer this prayer, the prayer that I had prayed and asked God to help me be more bold and intentional in sharing my faith. So when it came to Charlie Taylor, I knew that I had my work cut out for me. Well, I was determined with Charlie to break the ice. So I started watching where he would eat lunch. And he would just find a quiet corner somewhere, the edge of a building, and sit there during lunch and break out his lunchbox, and he would eat. And on one hand, I felt sorry for the guy because, man, he's all alone and nobody wants to eat lunch with him. And at the same time, I'm thinking, well, I don't really want to eat lunch with him. But I felt like God was saying, here's your project. You want to learn how to be intentional. You want to learn how to share your faith. Here's a great way to do that. Well, I started inching my way closer over the days, eating lunch with him, and finally started talking with him a little bit, and eventually, I would say he began to crack. I even got to watch him smile a couple times. I knew I was in one day when he pulled out his wallet. Now, I doubt anybody still has this, but he pulled out his wallet and he began to show me family pictures. Anybody still have a wallet with family pictures in it? A couple of us old guys, exactly, right? All right. So I knew I was in when he did that, and I thought, okay, this is cool. Well, I eventually, to make a long story short, got to share my story with him. And he seemed, I'll say, to appreciate what I shared with him. He showed me respect. I mean, he never, made fun of me or seemed like he wasn't interested. He really seemed interested. And he would eventually retire, and I would never see him again. And all I could hope was that I had made as much of an impression on him as he had made on me. Now, why do I share all of that with you? We're in this series called Storytellers, where we're learning to become storytellers of the greatest story ever told. Now, I've made this statement a couple times that when it comes to sharing that story. God's story, his story, is best told when his story is what? Our story. All right? And so we're learning how to do that. Well, today I want to talk to you about earning the right to share that story. Over the last couple of weeks, some of these cards are still in the lobby. If you haven't got one, there's a card there, how to organize your story. And so there's some blanks you can fill in. What was your life like before? What was it like after? You can kind of share the moment where you became a Christ follower. And maybe if there's a special verse that means to you. If you haven't done this yet, you need to do this. You need to practice this. And hopefully after today, you'll do that. And then last week, we had some fun. I had a couple people on stage. We had a bunch of props. And I told you God's story and 3 important things that we needed to know. So if you missed that, I would encourage you to go back and check that out as well. Well, again, today I want to talk to you about earning the right to tell the story. I want to talk to you about being intentional about relationship building. So this verse in Proverbs 18:24, and it says this: a man who has friends must himself be friendly. Now, that's a duh thing, okay? But some of us wonder why we don't have friends, and it's because, well, to be honest with you, we're not very friendly to begin with. And I think old man Charlie Taylor was the epitome of that, the negative side of that verse. I mean, he was the most unfriendly person you ever met until him and I became friends, and we began to share lunch together and even share stories together. But a man who has friends must show himself to be friendly. Now, I know we're busy. And the last thing that many of us need or have time for is, I'll say, more relationships. In fact, if we're honest, we probably wish we could get rid of some of the relationships that we have, because they just require a lot of work. But what if we were more intentional about the relationships that we do have? And what if those relationships could not only change our life, because they can, but especially if we're intentional about some things, but it could also change their life as well. So I found this verse many years ago to be so true. Paul writes this verse in fact, it's the smallest book in the New Testament. It's the book of Philemon. Most people don't even know that book is there. It's literally 1 page and not even a full page in my Bible. But it's a short letter that the Apostle Paul wrote, and he wrote it to 3 people. When you read it, that he identifies 3 people. He says, I'm writing to you. And one of the things that he says is this verse 6. He says, I pray that you may be active. Everybody say active. I pray that you may be active in sharing your faith so that you will have a full understanding. Everybody say understanding of every good thing that we have in Christ. Paul says to them and to every one of us, I pray that you will be active in telling the story, retelling your story. He says, because as you do it, yes, it has the potential to change other people's lives. But more importantly, here's what Paul says, it'll change your life. That's what he says. He says, so that you will have a full understanding of every good thing that we have in Christ. In other words, Paul's saying you can't have this full understanding unless you're active in sharing your faith. I was laying in bed last night thinking about this verse and thinking of something that the staff gave me for my birthday just a couple of months ago. And it says, I fish and I know things. And I thought, this little block of wood, that saying is exactly what that verse is saying. All right, so we've talked about that God has called us to be fishermen of men, to be storytellers. All right, we've unpacked that through the series. So here's what Paul says. If we're actively doing that, there's things that we will know that we won't know otherwise. So if you think you're missing out on some things and you're not sharing your faith, the truth is you are missing out on some things. There's some things that you can't appreciate about a God, about his story, about the work that he's done in your life until you become active at sharing your faith with others, at retelling that story. So let's talk just for a second about building relationships or more importantly, building friendships on purpose with a purpose. Now, a couple weeks ago, I introduced you to the dot, and it's been fun to walk around secretly watching. Some of you have placed your dot on your watch. Some of you, I don't have my phone up here, but some of you, I've noticed it on the face of your phone, and some of you, it's no telling where you've probably put it. But if you've done that, what I'm excited about is at some point in the future, somebody's going to hear your story. Because you can't look at that dot and not think about that person, okay, and wanting to share your story with them. You say, what's the significance of the dot? Well, I don't have an acrostic or anything that goes along with it or whatever, other than it's just supposed to be something that reminds us to pray for and be intentional about building a relationship with somebody else. Here's what I came up with. If you want to, it's just dot maybe could be determined to tell. So every time I look at this, and I shared with you guys, I met with my dad a couple weeks ago, and he's going to be getting baptized here in the next couple months, so I'm excited about that. But that's been a 42-year journey with my dot. But every time I looked at that, I was always reminded, and I need to pray about this. I need to be intentional about building a relationship with him so that I can do just that. So I want to give you a couple of things just to think about this morning when building friendships, some things to keep in mind. So I'll create this little list. So the first one on the list is this: earn the right. We have to earn the right to share his story. Now, there are times where God just puts you in a situation and I mean, you haven't had time to build a relationship, but that person's asking questions and you're going to jump right in there with that. But there are times where we have to earn the right. And by that, I mean, sometimes we have to be the good news before we can share the good news. Does that make sense? And I felt that was the way with old man Charlie Taylor. It's like if I'd have just jumped in and began to share the story with him, he'd have probably got up and walked away knowing Charlie, all right? So I had to earn that right. I had to earn that friendship with him. And so the next thing on the list is be respectful, all right? So as you're building that relationship, be respectful with that person, okay? You want to earn the right. And I want to say be authentic in doing this, in building that relationship. And hopefully with what I'm going to share with you when we close, that will make more sense and you'll feel even a greater urgency to do that. So earn the right, be respectful, and next, pray. Now, here's what you're not praying. You're not praying, God, should I share my story or should I not? Okay? We already know the answer to that story, right? God's already commissioned us, called us to be storytellers. So we're not praying if. What we're really praying for is what? Anybody want to guess? When. Okay? We've been talking about how and what to share, okay? And so now we're looking for the opportunity of when. God, make me sensitive to when it might be appropriate to share my story with them. So be respectful, pray. Next on the list, ask questions. The greatest way to get to know somebody is to ask them questions. I would ask Charlie about his family. Do you have, are you married? How long have you been married? Do you have any kids, any grandkids? And that's when he just began, as I got him talking more about himself, and then I was genuinely interested. And I'm telling you, when he pulled out his pictures of his grandkids, he was a different person. And now being a grandfather, I understand that more than anybody, okay? And so ask questions. Ask questions about, anything and everything. Did you ever go to church? Or, what was your experience with church? What do you believe about God? I mean, as you build this relationship, do you have any interests? You like sports? Get to genuinely know them. And the best way to do that is simply to ask questions. And then as you even get closer to that point of sharing your story, or maybe even crossing the line, as we're going to talk about next week, there's some other questions that you can ask, I would say, to assess the readiness of where they're at in their spiritual journey. And so, again, ask questions. Next on the list, listen. Everybody say listen. For some of us, it's very hard to listen. You know why? Because we're so anxious to talk and tell our story and interject. And sometimes, as hard as it is to do, we just need to genuinely listen. Give them time to talk. Give them time to tell their story. And then as you're listening to them, listen for places where their story and your story intersect with each other. Because that might be a good moment, either in that conversation or next or one coming up, where you can bring up spiritual matters and begin to move toward the opportunity of sharing your story. And then last but not least, share. Share. Be ready. The verses we've talked about the last couple weeks, one of them is be ready always to share your story. And sometimes we think we're ready till that opportunity presents itself, and so that's where this comes into play. Work on your story, all right? Tell it, you want to work on it to where if I've got a minute and a half to share it, I can share it. If I've got an hour to share it, then you can go into more detail. But hone your story in so that it makes sense, so that you're not stumbling through it, so that you can be poignant about what you want to share with that person. So again, when it comes to relationships, earn the right. We got to earn the right. Be respectful. Pray, not if, but when. Listen. Ask questions. Share. All right? So it's just some simple things for you to remember. Now, I want to shift gears for a moment. And share something with you that God spoke into my life this week. It's not, I won't say it's anything new, but God took it to a much deeper level for me this week. There's this verse, Proverbs 11:30. It says this: "The fruit of the righteous is a tree of life, and he who wins souls is wise." Everybody say win souls. The fruit of the righteous is a tree of life, and he who wins souls is wise. So I've been listening to this, I'll say, very long conversation between these 7 men from various walks of life. And my language, they're brainiacs. I mean, they're just, the amount of information they have in their brains makes my brain hurt, okay? I don't know how anybody could retain as much as they do, or even have the time to learn as much as these guys have. But it's been fascinating to listen to them. And when I say they're from all walks of life, they are. Some are believers. Some are what I would call very orthodox believers, very traditional in their thinking. Some are unbelievers. I don't think any of them I would classify as an atheist, but they're not there yet, like they maybe haven't put all the pieces together or whatever that's keeping them there. But they'll openly admit that they wouldn't classify themselves as believers. And so if you're ever looking for something to really stretch your brain, it's a guy named Jordan Peterson. Some of you probably heard of him. He does a lot of things called the Daily Wire. But there's an episode on there where him and this group of men go through the book of Exodus together, verse by verse. And it's been fascinating to listen to these guys. And while they come at it from I'll say somewhat of a very psychological point of view, obviously you can't study the Bible without spiritual matters coming up, okay? And so it's just fascinating to hear what they have to say and to look at this passage from different perspectives. And in their opinion, the book of Exodus is the one book in the Bible, whether you believe it or not, but the events that took place that determined and set up the rest of the world for all of history. And so that's why for them, they wanted to go back and look at it verse by verse and just unpack it. So again, I would encourage you, if you want to be challenged, take some time and do that. But as I listen to these guys, and the more I've listened to them, man, I'd love to spend time with all of them and even one-on-one with them at different times. But as I've listened to these guys, there seemed to be something in some of them that was missing in others. And it goes way beyond just some had a belief and some didn't have a belief. It was what some seemed to have and some didn't have. And as I sat thinking about this one morning this week, I had got up, did my 2-mile walk. That's when I listened to these guys mostly. I came back. I was thinking about what they were unpacking as they were going through this. They were in the part of the Ten Commandments in the second half, and it was just fascinating to listen to some of the things that they said. But as I was thinking about that, thinking about this season that we're in as Christians and Easter coming around the corner, and even thinking about this discussion that we're having on Sunday mornings right now, I thought about this verse. He that wins souls is wise. It's a verse that I've had memorized for a long time. And it's a verse that I remember people sharing with me that, this is why, telling your story is so important. It's all about evangelism. But as I sat the other morning on the back porch thinking about the words of this verse, he that wins souls, and that was the phrase, win souls, is wise. And I thought, what does that really mean? I mean, how do we win a soul? And win them for what? Or to what? And so I began to think about, well, what is a soul? The soul is that innermost part of who we are. Now, there's some people say, well, we don't even know if we have a soul. And I don't know how you even get there, but there's that part of us that I'll say it's inanimate. I mean, we can't touch it, we can't feel it, but there's just that inner part that just is exactly who we are. All the good, all the bad, all the emotions, all the feelings, all of the stuff that makes us who we are. And we are called and commissioned by God to be soul winners. Now, in a very simple way of looking at it, it's what we've been talking about. We're called, commissioned to be fishermen. We're called to go and make followers. We're called to be storytellers. But to what end? Of getting them into heaven one day? Or making sure they avoid hell? Is that really what it's all about? I thought, Grace shared with us this week that just in the first 3 months of this calendar year, we've seen 43 and now 44 souls won for Christ. And while that's exciting, I had to ask the question, but to what end? Just so that we could say and they could say, hey, I'm going to heaven when I die. Now, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. In fact, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. That's where it begins, no doubt. But winning souls can't just be about a destination. A don't think that's what the Bible has in mind. I know that's not what Jesus had in mind. It's so much more than that. It's about the journey to get there as much as it is about the destination itself. It was Jesus himself who said, I've come to give you back something that somebody stole from you. In fact, here's what it says, John 10:10. The thief comes only to steal and to kill and destroy, but I have come to give you life, life to the fullest. Jesus said, somebody took something from you, and I've come to give it back to you. And what I've come to give back to you is life. Life to the fullest. I sat thinking about this and this idea of being a soul winner. And something else that Jesus said came to mind. It's found in Matthew chapter 11 in the New Testament of our Bible. To give you a little bit of context to it. Jesus is speaking about the burdens that people were carrying around, okay? People were just, he looks at these crowds and he goes, you guys need something different. He said, you're so burdened and you're so worried, and you're worried about life, you're worried about spiritual matters. And as he looked at him, he said this in verse 28. He said, come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Come to me, he said, and I will give you rest. He continued, verse 29. He says, take my yoke up on you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. So in this, Jesus offers an invitation. He says, come to me and find rest for your souls. That inner part of who you are, which is often not at rest in many of us. And then there's the promise that he makes, that his yoke is easy and his burden is light. In other words, if you'll come to me and you find this rest, it's going to lead to a life of peace and fulfillment. It's going to lead to soul rest. The significance of all of this, well, the core teaching of the message of the gospel, the story that we're sharing with other people, is offering hope and comfort to those who feel overwhelmed and burdened by life's challenges. So there are those who have found that soul rest, and there are those who have not. Those who have found it, I want to say this, those who have found it, their life isn't necessarily any easier than those who haven't found it. Easier in the sense that they still experience all the pains and the brokenness and the hurts and all the bad stuff that still goes along with life. As long as we're in this world, that's going to be true of every single one of us. But in the midst of those things, those who have found this soul rest, if you will, are those who have found a way to rest in the middle of that. They have this peace with their Creator, with even the world around them. They're at peace with the final outcome of things. And so when we're called to be soul winners, we're not just keeping people out of hell and making sure they go to heaven. And that's an important thing, trust me, all right? But it's so much more than that. We're helping them to find rest for their souls as they get into a personal relationship with the God who created them. And so we're either soul winners or we're not, is basically what the Bible says. So if we're not sharing our story, not only are we hurting ourselves because there's some things about God that we just can't understand unless we are, but we're also hurting others because we're not allowing them to experience what we have experienced. So I just challenge you with that this morning, with the urgency of why this is so important. You have a peace in your heart. And if not, then go back to last week, the week before, a couple of things that I shared, that if that's not true about you, then maybe you need to figure out where you're at in this spiritual journey. Have you really placed your faith and trust in Christ? And if you haven't, guys, that's where it starts. It has to start there. But I also put this in my notes. There's one thing that we've not been able to rest from, those who have it. And that is the task of letting others know that they too can have that rest. This isn't just about a destination, it's about a journey to get there. And I'll go back to Proverbs 18:24. The fruit of the righteous is a tree of life, and he who wins souls is wise. Wise is the one who wins souls. Why? Because they know what they're helping others to find and experience. And they're building this tree of life. Every time we share the story and somebody places their faith, they become a part of the family. All right, and so that tree of life, the branches begin to get filled out. And so my prayer for you, now that I understand what Paul meant, I hope that you begin to understand what Paul is saying in Philemon 1:6. And so my prayer for you is the same prayer that Paul prayed for his friends. I pray that you may be active in sharing your faith so that you will have a full understanding of every good thing that we have in Christ. You know, I'm thankful for all the folks who have shared the story, have been storytellers in my life, those Sunday school teachers many years ago, even to my wife who shared her story with me on our unofficial first date night. And I say unofficial because it wasn't a date. We're going out with some other people, but I asked her out at the end of the night, and she said, well, before I can answer that, I need to know where you're at spiritually. And I said, what does that mean? And she began to share her story and the difference that God had made in her life just over the last couple of years in her life. And she said, I want that for you. And so we talked, and I said, well, it just so happens I'm meeting with the pastor tomorrow, and it was the very next day that I placed my faith and trust in Christ, and she was the first person that I got to call and tell that to. And then she said, yes, she would go out with me. So how cool was that? So kind of worked out all the way around. Now, so I said I've committed my life to do that, but to be honest with you, I haven't always been faithful in doing so. There have been seasons, just like the prophet Jeremiah, where I've thought, is it really worth it? Do people really care? Are they even interested in it? My story, let alone God's story. And so there would be seasons where I would just kind of drift away from that. But it wouldn't last long. One, because I think God just wouldn't let it. But two, because of what I had experienced. I think of the words of Jeremiah. He says, but if I say I will not mention his word or speak any more in his name, his word is in my heart like a fire shut up in my bones. I'm weary of holding it in. Indeed, I can't. Those of you who have experienced soul rest by placing your faith and trust in Jesus Christ, if you've really, really experienced that, then like Jeremiah, like myself, guys, you can't live with that. You can't live without finding some way to help others find that same rest for their soul as well. And so I've asked the band this morning to close us in a song, and I think you'll be able, if you found that rest, I think you're going to be able to identify with this song. And so here's my challenge. I'm going to let you start out sitting down, listening to this song. But as it starts, if it's true and you've experienced soul rest for yourself, there's no way that you will be able to remain seated this whole song and not sing along with these guys.